Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a look back at the most important aviation stories of the past week by the AIN editors who covered them. I'm AIN Alerts editor Chad Troutvetter. In this week's episode, Air Transport editor Gregory Polek gives highlights from the Boeing 737 MAX report issued this week by Congress. Editors Jerry Siebenmark and Curt Epstein discuss the controversy over the FBO contract awards at John Wayne Airport in Santa Ana, California, and how that will affect JSX's operations there. Curt also provides an overview of this week's Sustainable Aviation Fuel Summit and also highlights an unusual hybrid FBO hotel being built at Florida's Melbourne Airport. And Washington, D.C. based editor Kerry Lynch sums up Aerion's latest milestones for its AS2 supersonic business jet program. So on Wednesday, there was a report put out by Congress on the 737 MAX, and that's culminated from a bunch of hearings that they did earlier, right?
Yeah, the report came out. It was a 230-page report that was issued by the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing, but just reading some of the highlights, there's some pretty damning and scathing criticism of Boeing and the FAA. Some of the main points were pointed to a horrific culmination, quote, of a series of faulty technical assumptions by Boeing engineers and a lack of transparency on the part of Boeing management and grossly insufficient oversight by the FAA. So, a lot of it was, most of it were points that had already come out in the news over the last couple of years. But this really sort of validates a lot of the concerns, I think, that people have had, and that's particularly the families of the victims.
Was there anything new that came out of this?
I mean, certain things stood out. I mean, I don't know if anything was particularly new, but for example, the report said that Boeing incorrectly assumed that the pilots, who were largely unaware of the MCAS system, that's the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, which is a system that forces the nose of the airplane down in order to react to a high angle of attack issue. The pilots were largely unaware of the system, but Boeing incorrectly assumed that they'd be able to overcome any malfunction. And then the company apparently failed to classify MCAS as a safety critical system, which would have drawn further scrutiny from the FAA during the whole certification of the airplane. And then the report said that the operation of the MCAS violated Boeing's own internal design guidelines, calling for no objectionable interaction with the piloting of the airplane, and that it not interfere with dive recovery. I think one of the more interesting points had to do with the angle of attack disagree alert that did not operate on about probably a little bit more than 80% of the entire fleet. And the reason it was inoperable is because there was apparently some software issue that rendered it inoperable because it was connected to, it starts with the fact that the angle of attack indicator was an optional item on the airplane. The angle of attack disagree alert was tied to the angle of attack indicator. So what happened was this software problem rendered the angle of attack disagree alert inoperable, except in the airplanes that had the angle of attack indicator. I know that's a little confusing, maybe. Essentially, it wasn't operating on about 80% of the fleet, and that's despite the fact that it was certified as a standard aircraft feature. And then the report said that Boeing concealed our internal test data that revealed it took a company test pilot more than 10 seconds to diagnose and respond to an uncommanded MCAS activation in a flight simulator. This kind of goes to the whole point about, I mean, in a lot of circles, people have sort of pointed to the pilots as being, perhaps not particularly qualified or somehow deficient compared to U.S. pilots, for example. But in Boeing's own testing in the simulator, it showed that even the test pilot characterized the situation as catastrophic because it took so long to respond to the uncommanded MCAS activation. Federal guidelines assume pilots will respond to the condition within 4 seconds, apparently. So that's quite a long time.
So even the Boeing test pilots were 2.5 times over that limit.
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess the overarching thing here is that that perhaps a lot of the allegations is that the FAA was too cozy with Boeing and relied on Boeing too much and not enough oversight, right?
Yeah, that's right. They found inherent conflicts of interest between Boeing and the FAA because then they documented a few cases or several cases where the Boeing authorized representatives didn't disclose information to the FAA that the report said could have enhanced the safety of the MAX in general. But in some cases, for example, a Boeing representative raised concerns internally in 2016 about the MAX, but didn't relay them to the FAA. And then of course, the concerns failed to result in adequate design changes, according to the report. The committee cited as core contributing factors to the crash is the company's failure to address the issues that the AR raised, including concerns about repetitive MCAS activations and the effects of a faulty angle of attack data on the system. There are a lot of controversy over the fact that the MCAS activates based on only one angle of attack indicator. This is sort of at the crux of the whole thing. I mean, there are two, but the MCAS will activate if just one of if it could activate if only one of those AOA indicators are showing a problem. Even EASA says that they think there should be 3 angle of attack indicators on the airplane. It was really, like I said, a scathing commentary on not only Boeing but the FAA and the relationship between the two of them, and it sort of put a bow on the whole thing. I asked Boeing for comment, and they acknowledged that they said that they had instituted several organizational and process changes to advance the safety culture at the company. And in fact, they created a permanent safety committee within its board of directors and formed a product and services safety organization to review all the aspects of product safety. And then it actually reorganized its engineering department or function to require direct reporting to the chief engineer, where in fact before it was a much looser sort of reporting structure. And now it's apparently directly to the chief engineer that each engineer needs to, or each function actually goes to.
I think it looks like Boeing's making some changes, but when we're far from, this is probably far from the last report that we'll see from Congress too, right?
I don't know. I believe this is it from the House anyway. I think the Senate is working on something. I'm not really sure though, Chad, to be honest with you.
Yeah, but I'm sure we'll hear about this for years to come, and I'm sure we'll see stuff in legislation.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks, Greg. This week, the Orange County Airport Board approved the new FBO contracts. It not only affects the FBOs there, it also affects an operator, JSX, which flies scheduled flights using ERJ 135s from the FBOs. And that's going to end under the new contracts, right, Jerry?
Yeah. So JSX as a public charter provider. So one of their sort of hooks is the fact that you can, instead of coming to the airport 2 hours early to get on board an airplane, with JSX, you can show up 20 minutes ahead of time and get right on, because it avoids the lines. And that's kind of how JSX has built its business. It utilizes, because it's a public charter, because it operates 30-seat airplanes, it's able to get around the whole boarding from a traditional passenger terminal, and instead uses FBOs, where passengers board and deboard their airplanes. And so at John Wayne Airport in Orange County, which is actually one of JSX's earliest markets, and it's also one of its, in terms of business, it's also one of its biggest. At John Wayne Airport, JSX uses ACI Jet, which is one of two FBO operators that was signed on to the new leases with the airport. JSX learned just last week that there's a clause in these new leases that the board of supervisors approved, which essentially sort of cuts out them from operating at John Wayne Airport through an FBO. Instead, they would have to operate through the normal passenger terminal,
and that breaks their model, right?
Right.
And that would take effect January 1st. They have 3 months before they have to figure out what they're really doing, right?
That's correct.
And and JSX doesn't know what they're doing quite yet, right?
No, exactly. I visited with the CEO of JSX, Alex Wilcox, a couple of times this week, just ahead of the meeting, and then immediately thereafter. Initially, he suggested that perhaps there's that somehow this clause violates sort of the maybe some of the funding mechanisms that the airport takes advantage of through the FAA. He also suggested that the company could consider legal action when I asked him about that. But immediately after the meeting, he told me, and I quote, they're reviewing all of its options, and that it's hoping that JSX can find some kind of accommodation from the airport.
Curt, these FBO contracts are not without controversy either.
No, Chad, they're not. Last month, when they announced the winners of the RFP process, they excluded Atlantic Aviation inexplicably, which scored the highest on the airport's own RSP grading scale. It got a 475 out of 500 points, as compared to about 390 something for Clay Lacy, which was chosen over it. So there is controversy there, and it depends to see whether it was due to the fact that the winning FBOs were the ones that checked off we're not going to allow scheduled service like JSX to be operating there. I reached out to Atlantic Aviation to see if that was true. They haven't gotten back to me. Also asked with the awarding of the contract, the leases this week, both companies received 35-year leases, Clay Lacy and ACI. I contacted Atlantic to see if this triggers any kind of a legal response from them, and I haven't heard from them, as I mentioned. Both sides on this, it's a politicized, polarized decision. Both sides are waging a media war in a publication called The Voice of Orange County, where there's sides waging their arguments in editorials. And Atlantic Aviation even responded to one of these, which cited Atlantic as being a price fixer. Atlantic responded directly to this, saying, "We did not, we never did, we never will fix pricing."
Well, that's kind of echoes an argument about 2 years ago when the airport replaced Signature with ACI Jet, right?
Yes, it does. And that was one of their justifications for not renewing Signature's lease and choosing ACI. And when the actual votes came up, initially ACI was voted unanimously to continue on there in the RFP process. And Clay Lacy only received a 3-2 margin of victory. Now, from what I understood of the process, is it needed a 4-1 decision to go forward with the lease awarding, and one of the supervisors then caved, saying he's doing it in the interests of moving forward. One remained steadfast in his opposition to awarding Clay Lacy the contract, but it became 4-1, so his point was moot. But it still remains to be seen if Atlantic has any legal recourse in this case, and whether they actually can challenge it. That the board went against the airport's own recommendations as to what it would prefer or what it chose the most suitable to conduct FBO business there at the airport.
Yeah, it seems kind of a circus.
Well, it's California for you, Chad.
All right. So we'll stay on the FBO theme here, Curt. So this week was the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Summit, and there were some announcements out of that with Signature too. So tell us a little bit about the summit and what news came around it.
Sure. Well, the summit's been advertised now for quite some time. It was originally supposed to have been a live event that would have been held in Washington in March, but obviously the COVID pandemic squashed that. And instead it became, like most everything else, an online-based event. It consisted of 4 seminars over 2 days, and they basically gathered everybody in the SAF business. I mean, you had the entire value supply chain represented, from the producers to the distributors to the FBOs to the end users, the operators themselves. You had the regulators speaking. You had all of the organizations speaking. You had the OEMs, all the major the heads of most of the major OEMs speaking. And all of it was really to show a united front about the industry's acceptance and urging of the use of SAF. Now, granted, this is still a very limited supply. I've heard the industry described as nascent. Don't know if it's at that yet, but they're in discussions with the producers. There is a lot of capacity that's going to be coming online over the next few years. The levels will be multiplying considerably from what they are now. And all of this is aimed at bringing SAF available in more places and at a closer price point to Jet A. Now, one of the major things that they did mention was the book and claim scheme, where right now the fuel is generally available close to where it is produced, and that has benefits of they don't have to pay much transportation costs because you transport it. That dilutes its environmental efficiency as more energy is spent to transport it. So it makes sense that it's available now close to where it's produced, and that would be places like Van Nuys. So what book and claim is say you want to use the sustainable alternative fuel out at, say, Teterboro. You're environmentally conscious and you're willing to pay the current premium to put this out there and use instead of regular jet fuel. You'll pay that price. You'll receive standard Jet A, but somewhere across the country in California where it's available, that fuel will be put into somebody else's fuel tank at the regular price. And as I like to say, we only have one environment. So where this is burned really doesn't matter as long as it is burned and that it takes advantage of the carbon life cycle savings and reductions that the sustainable aviation fuel presents.
And the buyer of the SAF on the East Coast gets the credits.
They get the environmental credits. Correct. They would get the environmental credits. As a matter of fact, there was one case that was brought up by a flight department based in Delaware. They decided they wanted to do this, but their local airport, which is Newcastle Airport, doesn't have SAF. So they contracted with Avfuel to purchase an entire shipment. which was brought to the airport, placed into the Atlantic Aviation's fuel tanks. And this flight department, the first thing they did was take a nice big load of it into their G550. And then they got all the credits for the entire shipment of fuel, which was then used by all the other customers there at the Atlantic Newcastle facility.
And there was also some news from Signature, Neste, and NetJets, right?
Yes. So right prior to the start of the summit, Signature, Neste, which is the world's largest SAF producer currently, and NetJets released a statement with an agreement that Signature will now be receiving direct and permanent SAF supplies at its facility at San Francisco International and at London Luton airports. So that makes it the first time that an FBO has had continuously supplied SAF. Their deal is for about 5 million gallons of SAF currently. So that represents a pretty big offtake agreement. It's the largest agreement from an FBO. And from what I understand, Signature will be running this book and claim mechanism whereby customers at other Signature locations who wish to use or wish to fund SAF use can purchase the SAF fuel, which will be dispersed at these locations. So that is good news for the industry. And NetJets has signed on as the launch customer for this, and they said that all of their aircraft out of San Francisco International will be fueling on this, and as well, all aircraft leaving out of their Columbus International airport base will be using this also as part of the book and claim. So NetJets is signing on with this, and that's what's really going to take, according to the summit, the webinars. That's really what it's going to take to move the needle on this, is that have big operators sign on to this and sign on for large amounts of this, which is going to prove that there's demand, which is going to prove to, it's a trickle-down effect. If they show there's demand, it's going to show investors that there is demand for this product, that there is a market for it, to put their investment into this industry, which can continue to expand. And then it becomes just a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more investment they get, the more expansion of the refineries and the capacity they'll get, and the more SAF will be into the market. Now, they're going to need this because Curt Edwards, who's the Secretary General of IBAC, he mentioned as hosting one of the webinars on regulator and stakeholders impressions. We may need as much as 500 million tons of SAF a year to fulfill the entire global industry's demands for it if they want to meet the various aspirational goals that have been set by aviation. So there will be more capacity coming online in the next couple of years, but again, it's still just very shy of what's needed, and much more development and investment and acceptance of the fuel needs to be done.
And SAF is the quickest path to get to the emissions reduction goals that the industry has set, right?
It's the only one that's it's a major tentpole. We'll put it that way. There's 4 tentpoles that they have. SAF is probably the most promising. In certain other procedures, there's several pathways for production right now. There are many more that are in the wings coming online in terms of production of SAF, so that's also going to help boost the production. But SAF is the one that's probably the most promising right now, and promises up to 80% life cycle emission reductions. And with SAF, the emissions don't come from the burning of the fuel themselves. It's not what's coming out of the tailpipe. It's the life cycle emissions. And you can look at it as it's by using renewable sources, it's recycling carbon that's already in the atmosphere. It's not liberating fresh carbon in the way of fossil fuels that have been sequestered away underground. It's using the carbon that's already out there in a continuous cycle. So that's where the benefits come from. So when you look at the SAF benefits, and they say 80%, 90%, 70%, it's really the efficiency of the life cycle of the fuel, not what comes out of the tailpipe. So they the other methods, of course, there's aircraft, airframe, and engine improvements and optimization. There is infrastructure in the way of air traffic control modifications that can make more direct routings and less engine on time. And then the last is market-based measures such as carbon offsets purchasing. So of the four, yes, they expect SAF to be the most, to carry the lion's share of the industry's carbon reduction or decarbonization hopes.
It's interesting. Thanks, Curt. So let's keep on the FBO theme again. Down in Melbourne, Florida, we heard about a new FBO/hotel hybrid. I don't think there's any of those out there. So what is it, and how are they going to make this work?
Well, I wouldn't say it's the new idea. There's one, Golden Isles Aviation in St. Simon's Island down in Georgia, and they have an adjoining hotel with the FBO, and they kind of share facilities. Pilots are allowed to use the pool at the hotel and things like that. And I'm sure there's discounted rates for pilots. But this one down in Melbourne is going to be a different. It's actually going to have the FBO integrated into the hotel. On the ground floor, the FBO is going to be there. It's going to be a full service FBO. It's going to have its own fuel trucks, which, like the other two FBOs on the field already, is going to draw from the Melbourne Airport's 200,000 gallon fuel tank farm. It's going to have its own ground equipment, its own line staff, and everything. So it's actually going to be integrated into the hotel, which will be a 5-story hotel, a Hyatt Place with about 140 rooms. It's going to have a rooftop bar and restaurant offering expansive views of the airport. And you'll be able to have taxi the airplanes pretty much right up to the hotel. It'll have its own ramp. So I spoke with the developer of the project, and he's very excited about this. And they expect it to be operational, I think, in 2022. And they say, especially with the airport, they're going to they have a lot of aviation industry presence there, aviation manufacturing on the airport. You've got Embraer, of course, L3 Harris. And now Aerion has announced it will be setting up its headquarters there as well, and its production facilities. So you're going to be having a lot of industry traffic there, and that's what the airport believes is needed. They said we've needed a hotel here for a long time. There isn't a hotel on the airport. There will be. And they're very much looking forward to this. To put in the hotel, they are demolishing the hotel and its ramp. They're demolishing a group of T hangars, which will be replaced somewhere else on the airport. They're eliminating an airport access road to accommodate the hotel being ramp side, and that's all going to take place on 3 acres. There's a part of a 12-acre vacant plot that's there. And the developer is working to negotiate a lease for the remaining 9 acres, which could, if this one works out, include another hotel or conference facilities or retail. So there's going to be some development going on there in that corner of the airport in Melbourne over the next several years.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. Actually, while we're talking about Melbourne Airport, Kerry, you just did some in mentioning Aerion as well. Aerion just did they're starting wind tunnel testing and have done some other milestones too. So what do they have to say over the past week?
Well, Chad, Aerion has been very, very busy. And let me back up a little bit. It really comes to their nailing down of what they think will be their final design this past spring. So that has really enabled them to forge full steam ahead on a multiple fronts now that they have this design in place. And the goal is to reach preliminary design review in 2021. It's pushed back a little because of COVID, and then begin production in 2023. So with that as the backdrop, one key thing is to validate this design. And so they're launching, as you said, wind tunnel testing. And this is taking place in France with the French Office of National Aerospace Research there. And they're going to be testing the aircraft to 3 times the speed of sound, or the design of it to 3 times the speed of sound, so they know that their design changes are solid and they can move forward with it. They're also employing some optimization tools that refine, using all sorts of thousands of data points that refine the design that they believe will eliminate the need to make a smaller initial model and will speed up this whole process so they can, get to PDR and get to production in 2023. Now, while they're working on the actual, refinement of the design of the aircraft, they're also having to go full speed ahead with a bunch of suppliers. And a number of them have been named over the years. But the interesting thing to me is all the suppliers they're picking are very well-established, well-known, traditional suppliers, which is going to reduce risk on an aircraft program that is pretty risky. In the past, and risky in the fact that it's supersonic, not necessarily that they don't have the design expertise. But they name BAE Systems as the provider of the flight control system, so it will be fly-by-wire, as you would imagine, and it's going to have the active flight control or the active flight control sticks. So the pilots will have a tactile feel of how the airplane is operating, especially as it approaches operating limits. They're also proceeding with Honeywell Aerospace. Now, that Honeywell had already been named as the avionics provider, but they're also now providing the connectivity suite, and they're incorporating Honeywell's new Forge flight management suite package. So that's in the joint definition phase. And they also named a supplier for cybersecurity at this company called Shift, SHIFT5, Shift 5. And Shift 5 has provided security systems for a range of transportation platforms. But they say that what they're working with Aerion in designing will be the most comprehensive yet in a commercial aviation platform. And one of the things that Tom Weiss, Aerion chairman, said about that, and I thought it's kind of interesting, is the way the world has evolved. Cybersecurity is now can't be an add-on. It has to be an integral part of your design. So, that they've just been a flurry of announcements. And as Curt mentioned, they are in Melbourne. They plan to break ground, I think, later this year or early next year on a huge, massive 300 million complex. But they do have an initial team there already working. And as a matter of fact, somebody who was sending along the news said that they're there now in Melbourne working.
Imagine we'll hear a lot more from Aerion in the next coming months. And
yeah, I think that it's becoming a full-time beat.
Thanks, Kerry. Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest aviation news from AIN.